Good afternoon. Thanks a lot for inviting me to act as discussant of Kevin Morgan's lecture. It is not an easy task to provide comments on Kevin's lecture because he is extremely convincing, and I think it's so difficult to disagree with him. And looking at his slides, I also realized that we have quite a high degree of cognitive proximity, and this might be the outcome of the fact that we have been working together on a large project on smart specialization for 3 years now. And I think it is unavoidable that one starts to share views after working together for such a long time. I liked quite a lot the historical overview on conceptions of the state, so from Adam Smith to Friedrich von Hayek, and from Hayek to the protagonists of what we call new industrial policy. And I agree with Kevin that these new conceptualizations have changed quite a lot the way we talk about the state and the way we think about what the role and what the functions of the state are. So there is indeed a welcome shift from equating the state with bureaucracy and incompetence towards recognizing that it plays a major role in innovation. But sometimes I also wonder, aren't we asking for too much from the state? I mean, these new concepts on the entrepreneurial state, the experimentalist state, the smart state, they make quite excessive demands on public sector bodies. So they are supposed to be entrepreneurial and innovative and risk-taking, and they should create markets, they should shape markets. They are supposed to be experimentalist and smart. So we are no longer glorifying the market, and this is good, but are we now glorifying the state? And are all these big ideas on the experimentalist state and the entrepreneurial state and the smart state, are they a vision or are they reality? And if they are more a vision than a reality, then the key question is, of course, can the state develop these capacities? And, well, some people are not too optimistic about that. And I think Kevin has done a good job in outlining what the barriers to the experimentalist state are and what the barriers to the entrepreneurial state are. But I agree with Kevin. I think we have to recognize and we have to acknowledge that these new concepts, in particular the work by Rodrik and Sable on the experimentalist state, they have added quite a lot to the innovation policy debate. And I think we can be grateful for the insights we can draw from this work. So now from rather general comments to more specific ones, I would like to elaborate on 3 issues. First, the smart state is not a single entity, and this is of course obvious, but zooming into the state apparatus leads us to a couple of questions, and I think not all of them have been discussed enough in relation to smart specialization. Then I would also like to say a few words about the challenge of creating bottom-up inclusive governance structures, which is one of the cornerstones of smart specialization. And finally, I have some comments on the smart state in less developed regions. And I think Kevin has done an excellent job in outlining what the challenges are and why it is important that the state plays a role as a curator, and why it is important that it uses its power, its convening power, as you have called it. So I would like to add a few thoughts on this and argue in favor of the outward-looking and anchoring state. So then let's start with the first issue. So the state is not a single entity, but sometimes we think of it and we talk about it as if it were. And this is, of course, an abstraction. And this abstraction blinds us to the complexity of the state apparatus. I think it is, of course, very well known that there is a large number of state institutions and functions that are distributed across the local, regional, national, EU policy level. And there is a variety of public authorities and organizations which have an influence on the innovation and transformation capacities of regional economies. So, but who is then the smart state? And so which organization within the state apparatus could be classified as smart? And sometimes my impression is that we tend to equate the smart state with the presence of those organizations who are in charge of designing and implementing smart specialization. I'm not saying that this is how you interpret, Kevin, how you interpret the concept, but talking with other people sometimes I get this impression. And well, having a few smart policy organizations in the region is of course necessary for enacting smart specialization. So but it is only a necessary condition, it is not a sufficient condition. Because the effect of these organizations will be rather small if there are not functioning coordination mechanisms in place. So there is a need, of course, for horizontal policy coordination, because we know that the rate and direction of innovation is not only influenced by innovation policy, but also by other types of policies, tax policies, environmental policies, skills policies, and so on. And we have quite nice evidence from our smart specialization project, how difficult it is to establish horizontal policy coordination mechanisms. So we have seen that in many regions that it is quite tricky to establish such mechanisms, so that departments within a regional government, for example, work together in a way that things really work out. Vertical policy coordination is of course also an issue. So we are looking here at the sound interplay of innovation policies and innovation strategies at different policy levels. And again, evidence from our Smart Spec project shows us that this is not such an easy task. Another challenge relates to autonomy, and I think Kevin has already talked a lot about it. So autonomy challenges point to the fact that if smartness is not combined with power, then the practical outcomes will be rather limited. And we have, of course, the nice case from northeast Romania, but there is much more evidence coming from our Smart Spec project that points exactly into this direction. So smart but powerless is indeed a problem in some of the regions, in particular in regions located in centralist states in the eastern part of Europe. So then my second point, how to create bottom-up and inclusive governance structures in the region. Smart Spec is not about insulating the public sector from the private one. So this is a key principle of Smart Spec. It is the opposite. So Smart Spec requires new forms of interactions between the public sector and the private sector. But there are a few things that require further examination, and I think require further discussion. Because creating new linkages to the private sector is of course a must, but it always comes with the risk that there might be policy capture by vested interest groups. And the question how to overcome trade-offs of embedded autonomy and which kind of institutional infrastructure is required in order to balance between embeddedness and independence is, I think, one of the key questions, and we haven't discussed it enough, at least not in my view. Another key question is the coordination capacity of the private sector. So we tend to focus on the public sector and ask if it is organized in a way so that it can interact with the private sector, with non-policy actors. But what's about the coordination capacity of the private sector? So which kind of business organizations do we need? Which kind of cluster organizations do we need in order to ensure coordination within the private sector and to turn the private sector into a good interaction partner for the public sector? Another question here is, of course, how to deal with newly emerging sectors, which are often poorly represented and suffer from low visibility. But these newly emerging sectors or these newly emerging actors, they represent the future, and it is important to include them in bottom-up inclusive governance setups. What we have seen in our smart specialization project, so we have looked at 16 different regions across Europe. We have seen that there is quite a lot of experimentation going on in these regions when it comes to create inclusive governance structures. And there is evidence for policy learning. So we found evidence that there is indeed a trend to go beyond top-down policies and to include stakeholders in policy making processes. And in the regions which did that already in the past, we can see that they now start to go beyond the usual suspects and start to include new stakeholders. So, but several challenges remain, and I summarize them in 2 bullet points. So if we look at better developed regions, then we can see that one of the key challenges there is to find a good balance between established actors and new actors when it comes to the inclusion of stakeholders. So on the one hand, the established actors are of course still needed because they have the capacity to mobilize other actors. But at the same time, we need new actors because they represent the future. And sometimes we have also give voice to previously overlooked actors. And this is not always an easy task. But there is at the same time some evidence that some regions really go beyond the so-called triple helix constellation and open up for new stakeholders. And I think this is a very positive trend. So if we look then at the less developed regions, then we can see that one of the key challenges for the public sector is to find the right partners for interaction and for working together in order to identify policy priorities. Because on the one hand, we have many small and medium-sized companies in these regions, but they have limited capabilities and cannot contribute that much to smart specialization. And on the other hand, these regions often host only a few strong elements. And these strong elements include multinational companies and universities. So at least in some regions this is the case. And these players are not so interested in engaging in interaction with the public sector and in making a contribution to smart specialization and engaging in discussion processes. So, and then let me continue with the less developed regions. And let me add a few words on the role of the state in less developed regions. An important question is, of course, is the state part of the solution or is it part of the problem? And if we look at the quality of government data that Kevin has just presented, then one might be inclined to say, well, it's part of the problem. And there is indeed, I would say, yeah, some compelling evidence that the quality of government is really one of the key things in these regions. There is very, very nice work by Andrés Rodríguez Bose and Marco Di Cataldo. So they have really shown that poor quality of government represents a fundamental barrier to regional development and innovation in these regions. And this is also why they say that institutional reform is extremely important, and innovation policy in these regions has to go hand in hand with institutional reforms, because otherwise the returns of innovation policy will be very small. Improving the institutional conditions is a key thing for these regions. But I would also like to add that less developed regions are not a homogeneous group. And there is quite a difference between less developed regions depending on whether they are located in the southern part of Europe, or if they are located in the eastern part of Europe, or if they are situated in central and northern parts of Europe. So there is a difference when it comes to opportunities and challenges, but dealing with the question in a more general way. So what can less developed regions do when they want to diversify their regional economies, when they want to go for economic transformation, which is one of the key aims of smart specialization? Path extension is not an option, because path extension means continuity based on a few incremental innovations. But path upgrading is an interesting option for this region. So path upgrading means that existing industries in these regions modernize themselves by, for example, using new scientific knowledge or technological knowledge or organizational knowledge. And what we have seen in our SmartSpec project is that indeed many of the less developed regions go for path upgrading or path modernization. Path branching might be another interesting option. So path branching means that new sectors grow out of existing ones. But not all regions, of course, have strong potentials to go for path branching. Path importation might be an interesting option. Path importation means that means to use non-local knowledge in a strategic way in order to diversify the regional economy. And new path creation is very often out of the reach of these regions, because this really means creating entirely new sectors. But I would say we haven't talked enough about path importation, at least not in relation to smart specialization. And I am very glad to see that now, we have now begun to talk about how important path importation might be. Some of you may know the work by Thyssen and Van Oort on trade linkages, and also the work by Boschma, who argues that, well, new knowledge can be imported into the region through trade linkages. Colleagues at the Smart Specialization Platform in Seville are now starting to discuss which contributions can global value chains make to smart specialization? What is the role of global innovation networks, and so on and so forth? And I think this is very promising. But which type of policy do we need then, if path importation should also be taken into consideration, if we think about smart specialization and how to diversify regional economies? So I would say the outward-looking state is a good answer to this question, because activating endogenous potentials is of course important, but we have to take into consideration that more often than not, the endogenous potentials in these regions are limited. So making strategic use of exogenous sources of transformation might indeed be an interesting option. But we must not forget that one of the key problems of these regions is that they, of course, they need non-local knowledge more than other regions, but at the same time they suffer from a quite weak attraction capacity and absorption capacity of this non-local knowledge. So this then summarizes my argument. So as said before, so less developed regions, which very often have rather thin innovation system structures, they have a high need for non-local knowledge, whilst at the same time the attraction capacity and the anchoring capacity is rather low, at least when compared to regions which have thicker structures. But nevertheless, smart specialization and non-local sources of transformation needs to be one of the things to consider in this discussion. And there are many different forms of non-local sources, potential non-local sources of information. I have already mentioned trade linkages and R&D collaborations and global innovation networks and global value chains, but also the arrival of new actors from outside the region could make a difference. So, and this might be organizational actors, just the relocation of a firm, for example, but also individual actors, so the inflow of talent from outside the region. So it is an important task for the outward-looking state to attract these non-local sources of information. But attraction is not enough. I think the state has also an important task of the state is also to create a favorable environment for the local diffusion of this incoming knowledge. So we need policies to promote the absorption and the anchoring capacity. And such absorption and anchoring capacities might, of course, consist of system policies. So this is what we always say, right? That it is important that we create networks at the regional level between different actors. But one of the key problems in less developed regions is that the actors, many actors are rather weak, and if we create linkages between weak actors, then this might, it is important, but it is not enough. So I would argue in favor of actor-based policies, so strengthening also actors in their capacities to attract knowledge from outside and to anchor it and to diffuse it within the region. So a combination of actor-based and system-based policies might be one of the interesting ways to go for these regions. And then I stop here, and thank you very much.